Hello and welcome to this video on why humans are parasitized by some species but not by others. Anybody who's ever dealt with children of a school age or remembers their younger years will recall the problem of lice, whether it was that you yourself experienced the joy of treating them or the broader warnings that have been detected in your school, class and so on. What you likely did not see is a warning about an outbreak of fleas. A scenario all the more confounding when apes can get both fleas and lice. This raises the question of why you might experience one parasitic organism but not another. To understand the difference underlying this and other parasitic organisms, we first need to establish and understand what a parasite is. By definition, a parasite is an organism that lives and feeds on or in an organism of a different species, and will generally cause harm to the host. This definition starts to help to understand our example comparison of fleas and lice. Fleas can live on other mammals, birds, and rodents, for example, livestock, dogs, cats, any number of creatures. In fact, there are thousands of different types of fleas across the world, so we're not just talking about one particular example. What is important is that fleas are attracted to animals that have fur or, in some cases, feathers. That's because they can burrow into their bodies and hide in these layers of fur and feathers. This means they can both hide and feed. It also means they have somewhere to lay their eggs, and this is the important distinction. They're able to lay their eggs, feed and reproduce and effectively establish a colony. And this means they can go through the entire life cycle that a flea has. Fleas can't live on humans by comparison because, well, we don't have significant amounts of hair. Or at least not significant amounts of hair like other species do. We are, after all, the naked ape. It is very difficult for the flea to go through the entire life cycle without the protection of hair, fur, or feathers that extensively cover the body. Some studies have found that it is possible for that to happen, but you'd have to have a flea on your body for at least 12 hours, and that's only with a chance of colonization. Not actually a colonizing event every time. And so if you only have one flea that lands on you, and it can't survive for 12 hours, the chances are practically none. There are, by comparison, 3 types of lice, although realistically there's one type of lice but found in 3 distinct locations. The head lice, which are found rather obviously on your head or the scalp more accurately. You have body lice, and these tend to live in clothing and bedding rather than onto the skin itself, but they feed from the skin. And then you have pubic lice. Pubic lice are otherwise known as crabs, and, well, given their name, you can rather obviously figure out where you'd find them. Unlike fleas, lice can live on the human hair follicle, and they can go through their entire life cycle. This perhaps best demonstrates, at least initially, why it is that humans can get lice but not fleas, and that unlike fleas, lice have a particular capacities, let's say, that fleas don't, and vice versa. Based on this, we can establish that some parasites require specific environmental conditions. For example, limpets. These need an aqueous environment. Limpets are worm-like creatures with a rather disgusting maw. They will bite onto their host and begin to suck blood. This is also how they get their nutrition. Obviously, humans rarely experience prolonged periods in water, but when we do, there are other parasites that can take advantage of us. Much like the limpet, a leech can do exactly the same thing. But because of this, we can also look at the fact that we're not in the right environment. Simply put, based on this, we can say environment is rather explanatory for many reasons, or many species that will or will not parasitize humans, unless you are either in, or in some cases around the environment in which the parasite exists. You have no obvious risk, as leeches rely less on the human host exclusively, but rather opportunistically. We can either avoid them, or they can avoid us and survive just as well. But these are just some examples. Going from what is arguably above the skin to on the skin, we can then go into the skin. Among the most common parasites we have are worms. As an example species, we can look at hookworms. Unlike other species, and especially those covered in feathers, thick hides, fur, or hair, humans are relatively naked. We are therefore vulnerable to the hookworm boring through our skin. based on our digestive system and the nature of the fecal matter generated. Since we drop feces that contain the hookworm larvae, we can then be reinfected, or if you are so unlucky as to step in someone else's droppings, you could be infected that way. By contrast, if other species either do not defecate with the parasite present or cannot have their skin penetrated by the larvae, they're not going to get infected. Of course, there is a major caveat for human exposure risk. Unlike just about all other animal species, we wear shoes. Since the sole of infection in this case is literally the soles of your feet, there is a direct physical barrier. Unless you walk barefoot, roll on the dirt, or otherwise expose your bare skin to the soil that contain hookworms, you have almost no risk. This is a case of the combination of behavior and culture that prevents infection of humans. From the skin, we can go further into the human body with tapeworms. Well, technically further in that the GI tract is part of your body and inside the body cavity, but it's also exposed to the outside world from your mouth to anus. In this case, humans are the host for the parasite, but not the carrier per se. In fact, the parasitic tapeworm requires a series of species and steps for this to work. In fact, you need a human host, they will defecate, the pig then somehow consumes part of this feces, they then become a host themselves, the pig then has the tapeworm grow in them, the eggs get into their other tissues that are particularly focusing on the muscle here, and this is then eaten by the human. The human is now infected again. Now, there are cultural practices, and this is arguably one reason why, for example, in Judeo-Christian practices, pork is prohibited. You can't eat it because historically, and we're talking very ancient history here, humans figured out that pigs were a bad thing to eat because they made you sick in the long term. It no doubt took many, many dead people to figure that out, but it was eventually a taboo of sorts. Beyond tapeworms, we have blood-borne parasites, and this goes right into the body. The most common parasite to consider as an example is malaria. Malaria requires not just the human to be infected, but to have a vector to spread the disease, in this case a mosquito, although the exact mosquito species can vary slightly based on location. Typically, you'll have an individual infected with malaria, and they get bitten by either the Anopheles mosquito, or the Anopheles mosquito is already carrying the infection from somebody who has been infected. This will then carry it to a new host where they bite them, and it will inoculate the individual, or in other words, infect them. This then leads to the parasitic organism, the early stages of the malaria parasite, getting into the bloodstream. Now, from the bloodstream, they go to the liver, and unfortunately here they begin to attack the hepatocytes. They grow inside them, and they begin to divide and make more of themselves. This takes up to 10 days, although as little as 2. Eventually, the hepatocyte will lyse and release thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands, of the parasitic organism. Now, at this point in time, it is not the full parasite, it's actually the earlier stage, and it's a form called the plasmodium cell. These enter the bloodstream, and then they find themselves a nice red blood cell. And then they enter this red blood cell, and it takes them up to 3 days, although as little as 1, to form more of themselves. And this process then leads to the release of even more of themselves. And the cycle will continue viciously after this, basically ad infinitum. The key here is that they're not exactly reproducing in all cases. To be more clear about it, most of them reproduce this way, but a small fraction will undergo speciation of a kind, although technically that's not correct. They'll turn into males and females, and these will then enter the bone marrow, and when they enter the bone marrow, they're able to be retaken by or reabsorbed and reinfect mosquitoes, continuing the rather nasty cycle in a new host again. Because of this, and because humans have the necessary portals of entry and later on channels, the malaria parasite is able to use and take advantage of humans, more so than other species, and because of this, it is able to do what it does. This is why humans have this as a disease that we're well aware of, whereas other species not so much. Finally, we have the example of Toxoplasma gondii. Now, we have an entire video dedicated to this, but in short, Toxoplasmosis gondii is somewhat more obscure and tedious in its reproduction cycle. Not only can it live in the human body to some extent and also go through multiple other host species, in terms of the human species, it has a reproductive cycle fundamentally dedicated to the nature of the human body, although it can do the same thing in other species. But it depends very much on the nature of the GI tract and certain other features. Unlike the other parasites that live in the human body and spend a brief time outside to find a new host, Toxoplasmosa it can live in the human host purely, and from here it gets secreted in various ways, mostly in feces. However, there's also a mechanism by which it goes through other species, and when it goes through the other species, there's an entirely different mechanism at play, and this allows for a different reproductive cycle. That means that even if the human host had been able to completely eradicate it, other species could carry it, and they could then come back and reinfect humans, and it would be different again. The reason it works this way is that, well, fundamentally it comes down to a question of what are the contents of the GI tract and whether or not there are certain enzymes present. Based on this, you can see how humans are susceptible to some parasites, just the same as other species. This is one reason why we are, in some ways, at risk of certain diseases, just as any other species would be. The problem is largely one of the life cycle of parasites, the environment, the human biome, and cofactors, portals of entry, or similar protein channels, our own grooming behaviors, and in some cases adaptation to avoid the parasite in question. For the most part, those parasites that we are vulnerable to, we've tried to adapt ourselves to try and avoid. We've changed behaviors. Where we can't avoid the behavior, we've tried to cut off the exposure risk, and so on. Ultimately, most of what the human is vulnerable to now, we don't really deal with very often because we've gone out of our way to stop it from being an issue. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.